Hello, and welcome for joining me. Once again, maybe you're actually watching on Easter, and if so, happy Easter. I thought I would try and get this out as soon as I could with a lot of activities on this weekend, but as I was preparing, I thought of a book that was produced in November of 2010. It was entitled Heaven is for Real. And within 10 weeks, it had risen to number 3 in the New York Times bestseller list. And by January, a few months later, there were 200,000 copies in print. And by March 2nd, it had reached number 1 on the Times best-selling nonfiction paperback category. And it stayed in the top 10 for several weeks. That in less than a year and a half, it had sold like more than 1 million ebooks, and by 2014, more than 10 million copies. Even a feature film was released in April 16th of 2014, earning $101 million at the box office. And of course, if you're not familiar, maybe probably you are, but if you're not, it was really a story about a 3-year-old boy named Colton who had gotten really sick and had to have an emergency surgery on his appendix so that because he was in danger of dying. And after he had recovered, he had started to come out with these stories that he had no way of knowing the details of the things he was talking about, which intrigued his parents, of course. And he talked about a sister that he had that actually had been miscarried by his mother that they had never told him about, or his grandfather or a great-grandfather that had died like 30 years before he was even born, of where his mother and where his father were while he was in surgery and what he was doing or what they were doing. And so this sort of developed into him telling them that he had went to heaven. And as a result, the book was written and so on. But one of the things that comes out of that, I think a couple of things I want to draw from that. One is he talks about how that experience was a pivotal moment in his life, right? It is really changed. It really formed the direction he took. And that there are many other people with what we call near-death experiences that have these experiences, and they describe them as pivotal moments in their life. I think also the fact that it sold so many copies suggests that while we may fear death, we're very interested in what's happening after death. And today, as we talk about pivotal moments, now in our culture, of course, we celebrate Christmas quite a bit. It's the big deal, but Easter, not so much, but we know that it is a pivotal moment in history. And while other religious leaders are born and then die, our faith has a leader who died, but that came back to life and then never died ever again. And we have this story written by 4 biographers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I encourage you to take some time. This would be fairly long if I had to take that in time, but I encourage you to take the time to read the story of the crucifixion if you haven't had that already this week, and the story of the resurrection. And what's interesting about their biography that's different from other people who do biographies is they spend a lot of time on that week roughly around Jesus' crucifixion, his death, and his resurrection and some of the events that follow. And why is it that they take so much time on that? I think because they realize that this is the one event. These are the events, and particularly the resurrection is the event that creates the movement that becomes what we call Christianity, that creates the movement, that creates the church, that we're a part of the body of Christ. Now, when the women, of course, went to that tomb, it was empty. Later, some men go as well. But we knew that when the women went and they found it empty, they knew it was true news. But it took them a while to realize that it was good news. And we know that the men, they doubted that the women were right. And many, we know we have some story where, a couple of guys do go. Others, right, they're all staying hidden and they're fearful. And then they decide, you know what? They go back to fishing, and Jesus appears to them, and he eats with them. And he even says to Thomas, touch me, see, I'm not a ghost, right? I'm not a spirit, just some floating kind of thing, an apparition. Touch me, I'm this real thing. And when we talk about the resurrection, people have went to great lengths to try to disprove it, that and the crucifixion, because they know the implications. They understand the implications. One of those fellas that we may know about is Lee Strobel, who was an investigative reporter and journalist. He had the skills for this kind of thing. And when his wife became a Christian, he was like, I'm going to go show her that this is all just a bunch of nonsense. And so he started to investigate. And as a result of his investigation, as he tried to prove that the death and the resurrection were false, made up, so on, fake, what he found out was not what he thought. What he found changed his mind, and it changed his life. How has the resurrection affected your life? Now, Tom Wright writes a lot on this, and even John Ortberg has reflected on his and done sermons on some of his material. And we those of us that speak are really beholden to these scholars that have done great work on this area. For the first century Jews, they did believe in the resurrection, particularly the Pharisees. For them, the idea of the resurrection was real. And the Jews had long believed that the problem wasn't that we'll die, that we all die, but the world is a mess. It's filled with pain and suffering. And the crux of this problem is that humans can't fix the mess. The Jews believed that there is a great God who created all things, and that one day he would bring the righteous back to life and heal all of creation. They believed that righteousness is not about the after. They believe that the resurrection is not just about the afterlife, but a God perfected, God redeemed, God set right life. They believe that God would step in and forgive the sins of his people, establish justice, end suffering, heal creation, and then resurrect his people to enjoy the new creation. They believed that when this happened, it would be dramatic and obvious and deniable, done en masse to all of God's children. And this is important. They believed it all would happen at the end of history. And this is how John Ortberg explains some of Tom Wright's work. Right? They believed that they were living in this period, but one day, at the end of history, all of this would come to pass. But it would happen en masse, right? It wouldn't be just for one person. And so they were quite different than the people around them. The ancient people believed that life was just a cycle, an endless cycle. The human race, they just sort of die, right? But for Israel, they introduced to the human race the idea that history was headed somewhere. And why do I say this is to point out that nobody in Israel would have ever thought that one individual would have been resurrected in the middle of history. It was all to happen at the end of history all together. And if they wanted to make it up, that was just not in their framework of thinking. People wouldn't have believed them, and they certainly wouldn't have started by saying that the first witnesses of the resurrection were women, because women didn't have the status they enjoy today, comparatively. It just wasn't in their thinking. And so they were confronted with a whole different way of thinking with the resurrection as it happened. And why did they believe? Well, witnesses saw that the tomb was empty. Both men and women witnessed it. The local authorities wanted to hush all that up and cover it up, but they had no explanation. They made up something, but it's pretty flimsy. And we know that Jesus appeared in person to his followers. We read of different stories in the gospel, and even Apostle Paul later, after 20 years after Jesus' life, tells us, or shall we say within 20 years of Jesus' life, tells us that Jesus appeared to Peter and the remaining disciples and to more than 500. And John writes about this right away. And late in his life, he's saying this, he talks about it like it's burnt into his memory. I heard him, I seen him, I touched him. And they came to realize that the age to come that they thought was in the future was here. That they were the resurrected community. They were the ones who were dead in the sins, and Jesus had died for them. That God was going to begin to fix the world, maybe in some ways that they had not anticipated. That healing and redemption had begun now, and that God had been faithful to his promise in the resurrection of Christ. And so their lives were changed. And they took steps to follow in his ways, and they told others about Jesus. And they were so convinced, right, that many of them, they willingly died rather than pretend not know the truth of the resurrection. Including Peter, who before the resurrection and just before the crucifixion was denying Jesus, but as a result of those few days and all that went on, never again. That the crucifixion, the resurrection changed everything. And for all of them. See, they thought when Jesus was crucified it was over. But when the resurrection happened, they realized, no, it's not. If I was to say, and I want to ask us to think about this, how does this belief of the resurrection impact you? If I was to say, I am the resurrection and the life, no one can get to the Father except by means of me. If I said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one can get to God the Father except by means of me, what would you think? Liar, nutcase, mental health issues perhaps, scammer. If I said I'm God, what would you think? Yeah, right. Prove it. If I said, after you're going to kill me, and after 3 days, I'll come back to life. Again, you probably would say similar things. And the disciples didn't see this coming either. And so when it happened, it totally took them off guard. It had totally changed everything. There's a fellow who does YouTube videos, little shorts, a lot of shorts and YouTube videos, a Ukrainian fellow by the name of Antonelli. You might know of him. He's a strength trainer, you might say, or power lifter, who he's he goes around and he shoots these videos where he's pranking people, where he's just sort of a smaller guy and he dresses so you couldn't see a muscle on him. And he goes to these guys that are like twice as big as him, and he asks if he can work out with them, if he can warm up. They're at their limits and he said, "Oh, can I warm up with you?" And he has various little dialogues, but often the response are, some people laugh at him because they're all muscled up and he's just a slender looking guy, and he often pretends to be a janitor, and they laugh. Some of them are, oh, don't hurt yourself, and they're very concerned he doesn't hurt himself. Some scoff, some, they have different responses. Some occasionally even get irritated. But when he lifts, the smiles, the smirks, everything is gone, and there's instant respect. Their attitude and behavior change immediately. Some even reach out, looking and touching his body, his arms, for the muscles that they don't see beneath his coveralls. That they may have had one response, but when that event, when he just lifts with ease, and often does things they can't even do, even though they're twice his size and they've been at it for a long time. Right? Attitude, their behavior completely changes. And I think this was what it was like for those who met the resurrected Jesus and heard about the resurrected Jesus. And I want to ask you, what is your response to the resurrected Jesus? Rick Warren talks about two ways to get to heaven. He says there's the performance plan, where you earn it, that you earn your way by always hitting the mark, where you never make a mistake. Right? You're always doing the right thing, making the right decision, always saying the right things. You're perfect, as God is perfect. Or he says there's plan B, which God came up with, and that is you trust Jesus when he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life, that no one comes to the Father except through me." Right? That there's two options. The performance plan, where you're perfect all the time for your whole life, or the relationship with Jesus plan that offers forgiveness of our guilt, of our sin, and the power to live a new life in the now and also eternity in heaven. Right? And it's our move. It's what's your step? How are you going to respond to the resurrection of Jesus? John Ortberg tells the story of a friend of theirs, of he and his wife, who once shared how she had spent a great deal of her life living far from God. And over time she realized the limitations of her own self-sufficiency and pride, and feeling that she needed more information about God before she could commit to him, she spent about a year studying God and asking questions. And it wasn't long before she realized that her issue was no longer a lack of information, that she had commitment issues. That she had never actually surrendered her life to God, because she knew that if Jesus had raised from the dead, that fact changes everything. Just like when Antonelli lifted the weights, that changed everything for the guys that were around him. And this friend, and so she realized that changed everything. And this friend of hers decided that she wanted to confess her sin and receive forgiveness and start a new life. She wanted this change to be really clear. And so here's what she did. She went home and stood in the kitchen, staring at the threshold between her kitchen and the living room. And she said aloud, "God, when I step across that line, I want you to know that I'm leaving my old life behind. I'm leaving behind my sin. I want to be forgiven. I want to be your child. I want Jesus to be my forgiver and my friend and my leader." And then she walked across that line And she told us that was the biggest step I've ever taken in my life, because I entered into a relationship with God. And now when I have a problem or a question or doubt that I have, remember that line. I remember that step. I remember that He's with me. Have you taken that step? I just want to say, if not, today is a great step, a great day to take that step. And John, when he was an old man, it was a memory burnt into his brain. And Colton, now in his 20s, says there is hope. We get to have a relationship with God. Have you said yes to God? And he goes on to say, we don't have to wait till we're off of this world to have a relationship with God. We can start now. But there is also something much better waiting for us. The resurrection is not just good news. It's true news. And when Jesus says, whoever lives and believes in me will never die, that means that there will be no power ever able to take you away from our Father God. Consider taking that step today. Or maybe recommitting yourself to following God if you've slipped off the path. Thanks for listening.